So thank you to the Norwegian Atlantic Committee for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be in Norway. One of my I have multiple affiliations, the most recent of which is the Marine Corps University. So it's not in the program, but I have to mention, and it's on that slide, I have to mention that, and the Marines are thinking very carefully about China, just like the U.S. Marines are thinking very carefully about China, as are forces in Europe and elsewhere. So, quick disclaimer too, what I'm about to say represents my own views, not those of any organization with which I'm affiliated. Over the next few minutes, I'll talk about definitions, what some of these terms mean on the first slide, and the operating environment, missions, out-of-area responsibilities, and then lastly some implications for Norway and NATO. So I think the overall takeaway I hope that you will get from these few minutes that I have is that China militarily is still fundamentally a regional power, but a regional power with growing global presence. So let's see, I'm technologically challenged, so that's good. We're off to a good start. So those terms that I mentioned listed on the first slide. Military power, take it to mean basically power projection, the ability to project and sustain power. Now, it's of course a U.S. definition, but I can get away with that because of the next point I'm going to make, which China's aspirations are to create a world-class military. And who do they have in mind as the gold standard from a Chinese perspective? It's the U.S. Armed Forces. And this is a quote from the latest Chinese defense white paper. Also, what do I mean by armed forces? Or actually, what do the Chinese mean by armed forces? They mean more than just the PLA. When they talk about the People's Armed Forces, they're talking about not just active duty military, but the reserves and paramilitary forces like the People's Armed Police, the Coast Guard, and the militia. And the Admiral mentioned the maritime militia. So if you remember, Bob Ross yesterday was talking about making everyone depressed, talking about comparing numbers of surface vessels that the U.S. Navy has versus the PLA Navy. You can get even more depressed if you add in Chinese Coast Guard vessels. So important to keep that. Not ignore, not just focus exclusively on the PLA. Whoops. All right, so this is, in this slide, it's busy, but I'm trying to talk about the operating environment for China's armed forces. And it's not to be trite, but it's kind of a four-ring circus. And this conception of four rings of security or insecurity is not a Chinese one. It comes from a book I co-authored. And yet, when I present these ideas to Chinese audiences, no one ever says, "No, Andrew, you're wrong." Maybe they're too polite, but I do think this is an accurate conception of how the Chinese military and China's political leaders think about security. And the takeaway from this slide is it's internal. China's armed forces, their focus continues to be domestic and neighborhood responsibilities primarily. So that's why I talk about domestic drag, that there are still significant responsibilities, if not primary responsibilities, frontline responsibilities, at least backup responsibilities for China's PLA. Then the periphery and China's power or military power projection is really getting pretty good in the third ring, out to the third ring, within the Asia-Pacific neighborhood. It's still challenged to deal with power projection out beyond its immediate neighborhood into the fourth ring. And yet those overseas interests are expanding significantly, and it's a challenge how China's armed forces can deal with it. So what are the missions? This is a gross oversimplification, but in essence, I think the China's armed forces have three missions: two peacetime missions and one warfighting mission. So I won't dwell on the warfighting mission, but basically, first it's to protect, safeguard China's so-called core interests. Some of them are explicitly mentioned, some are implicit, but it's essentially territories that China claims or controls and wants to hold on to or acquire. But a more challenging set of interests or mission is to protect China's overseas interests, and this is a definition from the Chinese 2015 white paper, but really it boils down to people and stuff. And Chinese citizens are increasingly traveling, living, working in regions around the world. Some of these countries are pretty unstable. And so it's a challenge. The challenge that Beijing has is how to protect these things. So we tend to focus on infrastructure, the Belt and Road Initiative. How does China protect this infrastructure it's building? And that's a legitimate, thing to talk about. But I would suggest it's more important from Beijing's perspective to think about how to protect their people. So, we sometimes talk about the U.S. military being overstretched, overcommitted. I think it's important not to ignore this issue when you're thinking about China's armed forces. They are prone to being overstretched too, given these expanding overseas interests. So, how can China protect these growing overseas interests? Well, I've got a laundry list of possibilities, and actually China has pursued each one of these options, and they're not mutually exclusive. Improving its expeditionary capabilities, by the way, it seems like the Chinese Marines are being expanded to be set up to be a rapid reaction force. Still too early to say that for sure, but the point of this slide is to suggest that there are multiple ways for China to protect these overseas interests. So what does it all mean for Norway and NATO? One of the first bullet I'd like to highlight, because I think this is maybe underappreciated when we're thinking about power projection and so on. I think, okay, good. This is my last slide, so I'm right on target. So China really crossed the Rubicon when it established its first formal overseas base in 2017 in Djibouti, and this is a psychological barrier that China broke through, and there's no going back, because for years China could say proudly they had no troops stationed abroad, they didn't occupy 1 inch of foreign territory. That's changed, and I think we're likely to see more Chinese bases, probably on the rim. The next base will probably be somewhere on the rim of the Indian Ocean. But the other points, of course, China's more actively participating in military field exercises with other armed forces. Most of these are pretty small scale, but they do include a whole range of countries, including significantly Russia. Don't forget, China's armed forces operate in quite visible and also quite not so visible domains. We don't want to forget. So we heard about cyber the other day. But we don't want to overlook these other domains. And organizational reform, recent organizational reform suggests that the PLA and China's military might be more more capable of coordinating activities across these realms. So at the end of the day, the good news, the good news for Europe is that you're at the end of the Belt and Road, yellow brick road. So you're far away. But the bad news is that the Arctic is considered near for China. So Norway should be on alert. So to wrap up, for Europe, I think China for the foreseeable future will continue to be an economic heavyweight, a diplomatic lightweight, and a military featherweight. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Ben.